back then they were for very affluent people. If you looked at the price of these watches new and you adjust for inflation, the prices of these things was eye-watering. Someone had an original till receipt, and those numbers were up there with highly complicated Patek Philippe's, and these are time-only dress watches. Hello and welcome to the Collector's Table. Here at Subdial we've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole on stone dials of late, and today we'll be running through a selection of primarily Piaget stone dial watches, each representing different cuts of stone, different types of stone. The differences between the Piaget offerings and the outsider, which is Patek Philippe, the movements that power these wonderfully elegant watches. And we'll be talking about what the brands represented back in the day, in the 60s and the 70s, versus where they are positioned in today's market. And of course, we'll be deep diving on the stone dial types, how they look, how they wear, and what's their relative rarity. From Piaget, you have 4 different stone dials. First being the Tiger Eye. It's a caramelly brown with almost a honeycomb layer through it. Very layered looking dial, very evoking a lot of the 70s. Then we have Onyx. Onyx is a fascinating stone, frankly, because you get a good cut of it and it looks better in my mind than the sort of Vanta black that has been brought to the watch market by Moser and C. And they've spent lots of money using NASA quality technology to achieve something that exists in the real natural world. Very, very funny. And then we have jade. Some people call it nephrite, and there are various types of jade, but this one in particular has a nice contrast between the green and a sort of creamy white fleck to it. Just gives it a little bit more interest. Next, you've got coral, and it looks to me just like smoked salmon with the waves of the natural stone. It makes me want to eat sushi. I love it, and I don't know if I've seen that colour on an artificially man-made dial before. You see salmon dials, of course, but you don't see anything that exists that looks quite like that. At this time in Piaget, you could cherry pick a case type, a movement type, a stone type, bracelet, strap, which is why there are so many of these that are effectively piece uniques, because there are so many variations and permutations. And then just because you can't have a table of stone dial watches without including this, we've got a Patek Philippe 3733 with a lapis lazuli dial, this brilliant vibrant blue, which also has the benefit of having a lapis crown. The types of individual who wore these watches back in the 60s and 70s were absolutely of the jet set. The famous people that you'll have seen will be Jackie Kennedy, the iconic photo of her wearing a jade dial Piaget. It's an absolutely beautiful watch. Miles Davis, Sammy Davis Jr., Andy Warhol, they all wore Piaget watches. And I think it's fairly interesting how back then the brand was so famous and synonymous with well-known celebrity, affluent people. And for a number of decades, frankly, they were forgotten about. These watches plummeted in value. No one was really looking at them, a few niche collectors here and there. But we're really seeing a resurgence of the brand and interest in the brand. Back in the 60s, 70s, Piaget created a market for something that didn't exist. And a few years later, you have manufacturers like Patek and Vacheron that saw an opportunity and cashed in on the same audience. I think in terms of rarity, it's fair to say that they are all fairly rare watches. Although there's not much data on them, I'd argue that the data that does exist around pricing probably has a parallel to how many were made. The pricing that we've seen from the 60s, 70s suggests that Tiger Eye was one of the cheapest stone cuts, and broadly speaking, the numbers of watches that you see in the used market reflects that. At the other end of the spectrum, jade, lapis and coral are all fairly expensive, or they were to buy back then, a premium of 3 to 4 times. Whether there was a fashion that meant that jade was less fashionable, for instance, than Tiger Eye, I'm not sure. I think you would have to be fairly bold to be putting a coral dial into a watch and spending that much money on it. But I'm very glad that the person that did select this in coral, because it's just such a wonderful example. Piaget was right up there in the very upper echelon of jewellery manufacturing back then, and still really is today. Piaget invested a lot of money in designing thin movements, so that even though they paired it with a thicker stone dial, particularly notably thicker than different manufacturers that used similar dials, they were still able to produce a thin watch. The 9p movement is only 2 millimeters thick. The 12p counterpart, which came a few years later, is an automatic movement that's 2.3 millimeters thick. So both record-breaking movements for their thinness. So servicing them and unpairing them from the dial can be a fairly scary thing. These dials are very brittle, and the thicker they are, the more robust they are. So Piaget really invested their time and money in making those movements as good as they are, as thin as they are, and still creating a product that is elegant, thin, and comfortable to wear.